Historical introduction to diplomacy. The institution of diplomacy is reputed to be as old as history itself. It would certainly be accurate if one were to take into account the non-permanent ad hoc missions exchanged between the oldest nations in history during a period which may well be regarded as antiquity. In this video, we will look back to the historical development of diplomatic relation, particularly in Greeks, Romans, the Jews, Asian states, Empire of India, Islamic countries/West Asia, and European states. Then, we will learn about the rise of modern diplomacy. History records that in the earliest periods special missions were being exchanged between the Greek city-states. Thucydides, the Greek historian, speaks of diplomatic relations among the Greeks. And it is stated that even at that time ambassadors were ceremoniously received and courteously treated in each other's territory. It is said that by the 5th century BC, special missions between the city-states had become so frequent that something approaching our own system of regular diplomatic intercourse had been achieved. The early Romans maintained treaty relations with some of their neighbors, which were concluded with the active participation of their envoys. The Romans respected the foreign envoys, and as a general rule refrained from interference with the person or property of foreign ambassadors sent on the special mission to Rome. Amongst the Jews, the Hebrew kings maintained diplomatic relations only with certain friendly countries of their choice. They refused to have any kind of relations with most of their neighboring states whom they regarded either as uncivilized or as enemies. Nevertheless, the Jews had regard for observance of treaty relations, and they respected the ambassadors of friendly powers with whom they maintained relations. The contemporary Asian princes maintained diplomatic relations with their neighbors, and envoys were sent and received from time to time. The existence of a large body of rules in ancient India on foreign affairs, such as those contained in Arthasastra of Kautilya, the Nitisastra of Kamandaka, and the Matsya Purana, is illustrative of the fact that the diplomatic relations between ancient Indian states were fairly frequent. There is historical evidence to show that after the breakup of Alexander's empire, the new states, which had emerged as a consequence, maintained relations with the Mauryan Empire of India. There were several Greek ambassadors accredited to the court of Pataliputra, some of whom, like Megasthenes, were of a very high distinction. The Indian kings also sent their envoys to the Greek courts. And under Emperor Ashoka, the exchanges of envoys with other countries became more and more frequent. It is said that his dutas, ambassadors, were sent to distant lands like Syria, Egypt, Macedon, Epirus, and Cyrene. Harshavardhana, who ruled as the Emperor of North India in the 7th century AD, maintained diplomatic relations with China. The kingdoms in South and Southeast Asia also appear to have maintained contacts with China through their envoys. The Emperor of Sumatra and Java and King Meghavarana of Ceylon had also from time to time sent emissaries to India to facilitate the visit of Buddhist pilgrims. In West Asia, from the time of Prophet Muhammad, emissaries were sent abroad for religious or political purposes, and according to Muslim chronicles, the Prophet is reported to have sent envoys to Byzantium, Egypt, Persia, and Ethiopia. In the beginning, these emissaries were not concerned with promotion of international relations, their functions being limited to certain specified missions, such as negotiations or signing of peace treaties, or exchange of prisoners of war at the conclusion of a jihad, religious war, or in connection with the performance of formalities before such a war could be declared, such as an invitation to accept Islam. Later, however, during the period of Abbasid caliphs, the policy of peaceful and friendly relations between Islamic countries and other nations began to develop, and diplomacy naturally gained increasing significance, especially in matters of international trade. Muslim envoys were sent to the courts of several monarchs for various political, commercial, cultural, social, and other purposes. The Fatimid and Mamluk kings sent and received diplomatic missions to and from countries in Central and East Asia as well as Europe. And treaties of friendship and commerce were negotiated through their envoys. In Europe, the origin of diplomacy may be said to be contemporaneous with the breakup of the Roman Empire. Until that time, there was neither room nor need for development of international law or diplomatic relations. Since the Roman Empire had practically swallowed up the entire civilized world known in Europe. However, after the split of the empire in 395 AD in eastern and western halves, the kings in the eastern part of the empire freely began the practice of sending envoys to foreign courts for observation and reporting on the political situation, which became useful in maneuvers against potential rivals. Gradually, with the disintegration of the empire and the weight of various influences that were gaining ground in Europe, the feudal princes began resorting to the practice of exchanging envoys between themselves. Though the practice of exchanging envoys was in vogue amongst the ancient Greeks and Romans as also in the countries of Europe and Asia, the establishment of permanent missions is of a comparatively recent origin. Before the I-5th century, the European princes normally sent temporary diplomatic missions, which were to be terminated as soon as the particular purpose of the mission had been fulfilled. Similarly, in the countries of South and Southeast Asia and the Islamic countries of West Asia, the missions by and large were of a temporary character, which were sent for a specific purpose, whether it be political, economic, or cultural. It was the Italian republics, and Venice in particular, which were the first to recognize the advantages of maintaining permanent diplomatic missions at each other's capitals and introduced the practice of so doing. As Facile rightly points out, the history of diplomacy falls into two clearly distinct periods. The first is the period of non-permanent ad hoc embassies, covering antiquity, and the Middle Ages ending in the I-5th century. The second period is that of permanent legations, which originated in Italy in the I-5th century. The ferment of Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Industrial Revolution changed the face of the contemporary European world, which led to more and more contacts between the various nations in Europe. And the need of finding markets for an expanding industry made permanent representations almost essential. At the close of the I-5th century, England, France, Spain, and Germany had established legations at each other's courts, and in some cases the right to maintain permanent legations was secured by means of treaties, such as the treaty concluded in I-520 between the King of England and the Emperor of Germany. In the I-6th century, the Republic of Venice had established permanent legations at Vienna, Paris, Madrid, and Rome. After the Treaty of Westphalia, I-648, which confirmed the principle of balance of power in Europe and thus obliged states to keep watch on each other, the establishment of permanent diplomatic missions gradually became the common practice. Initially, however, certain states, such as France in the reign of Henry IV and England under Henry VII, vigorously opposed the establishment of embassies or legations. In I-65, the States General of Holland debated whether embassies were of any use. And in I-660 Poland proposed that all accredited ambassadors should be sent out of the country. The French Revolution, the wars which followed, and the spectacular industrial development which was then beginning to make itself felt, however, put an end to the isolation of states. Regular relations were established and it became necessary to seek agreement on some universally binding rules regarding the rights and privileges of foreign diplomats. The practice of accrediting envoys had become so common by then as to enable Grotius to assert there are two maxims in the law of nations relating to ambassadors which are generally accepted as established rules. The first is that ambassadors must be received, and the second that they must suffer no harm. The art of diplomacy found fruitful ground for development in the situation that followed the disintegration of the Holy Roman Empire. The constant need for watch for the sake of preservation of balance of power, and the friction amongst the princes of Germany produced diplomats of the caliber of Metternich and Bismarck. The European nations in the course of trade and commerce through the 17th and 18th centuries were brought into contact with nations in other parts of the globe, and the instances of their envoys being sent to the Eastern princes for negotiating treaties are not infrequent. Sir Thomas Roe was one of the well-known figures sent by the English king to the court of Mughal Emperor Jahangir at Delhi in the 17th century. Gradually, however, in the process of expansion, the European powers of the day, like England, France, Spain, Holland, and Portugal, conquered or colonized practically the whole of the known world in Asia and Africa, as well as the discovered territories of the Americas, with the result that the diplomatic relations became practically confined to European states and Turkey. Countries like China or Persia, though not actually conquered or colonized, became subject to many restrictive treaties, which greatly reduced their status and thus made it unnecessary to have diplomatic relations with them. The American independence and the gradual elimination of the colonial powers from the Americas gave rise to institution of diplomatic missions in that continent. Now, with the emergence of new nations of Asia and Africa, diplomatic relations between states in various parts of the world have become of universal application.